The blue lights of the Coalition flagship cast strange shadows across the metal walls as Jake Morrison walked down the corridor toward the briefing room. His boots made soft sounds on the floor that seemed too quiet in the massive ship. Other beings moved past him in the hallway, and most of them were much taller than he was. The Vorthans looked like giant lizards walking on two legs, and their scales caught the light as they moved. The Kalari were thin and pale with large black eyes that seemed to see everything. Jake had been working with these aliens for 3 years now, but he still felt small among them. The door to the briefing room slid open with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped inside. Admiral Kylex was already there waiting for him. The Vorthan Admiral was nearly 8 feet tall, and his dark blue scales had silver patterns that showed his high rank. His yellow eyes fixed on Jake as he entered, and Jake could see something that looked like anger or maybe frustration in that alien gaze. Jake had heard about the failed mission on Kepler 442b through the ship communications, but he did not know all the details yet. What he did know was that 12 elite Vorthon soldiers were dead, and the Coalition was not happy about it. The Vorthons were supposed to be the best fighters in the galaxy. They had perfect training and used computers to plan every move in battle. When they failed this badly, it meant something had gone very wrong. Admiral Kylex gestured to a chair across from him, and Jake sat down. The chair was too big for a human, but Jake had gotten used to that over the years. Everything in Coalition. Space was built for beings much larger than humans. Sometimes Jake wondered if that was part of the problem. Maybe the Coalition thought too big about everything. The Admiral touched a control panel, and a 3-dimensional image appeared in the air between them. It showed an asteroid floating in space with buildings carved into its rocky surface. Jake could see weapons platforms and shield generators built into the rock. It looked like a fortress that would be very hard to attack. Admiral Kylex began to speak in his deep voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. His words came through Jake's translator device a moment later. The device turned the alien language into English, but it could not change the tone. Jake could hear the frustration and anger even through the electronic voice. The Admiral explained that Dr. Lisa Park had been captured 3 weeks ago while studying crystal formations on a small moon in the outer territories. She was a human scientist who worked for the Coalition, studying how different minerals formed on alien worlds. Her research was important because it helped the Coalition find new materials for building ships and weapons. The Skari pirates had taken her from her research station and brought her to their base in the asteroid belt. The Skari were one of the biggest problems in this part of the galaxy. They were not part of any government or alliance. They lived by stealing from others and selling what they stole to anyone who would pay. Most of the time they took cargo or ships, but sometimes they took people too. When they took people, it was usually to sell them as slaves or to ask for money to give them back. Admiral Kylex showed Jake the tactical plan that the Vorthan team had used. The plan looked perfect on the screen. Every movement was calculated down to the second. The team would approach from 3 different directions at the same time. They would use their advanced weapons to destroy the outer defenses. Then they would move through the base in a pattern that would give them the best chance of finding Dr. Park while avoiding the most dangerous areas. The plan had failed completely. The Skari had been waiting for them. Every move the Vorthans made had been predicted and countered. The pirates had set traps in exactly the right places. They had moved their own fighters to block every escape route. It was as if they had seen the Vorthan plan before the battle even started. Jake studied the images of the failed attack. He could see the Vorthan approach routes and where they had been stopped. The Skari defensive positions made sense if you knew where the Vorthons were going to attack. But how could the pirates have known that? The Coalition tactical computers were supposed to be the best in the galaxy. They considered millions of different factors when making battle plans. Admiral Kylex explained that the Coalition needed Dr. Park back alive. She had information about new mineral deposits that could change the balance of power in this part of space. The Scari probably did not know how important she was, but they would figure it out soon enough. If they learned what she knew, they might sell that information to the Coalition's enemies. The Admiral's next words surprised Jake. The Coalition was putting together a new rescue team, and they wanted humans to be part of it. Jake would lead a small human unit that would work with a larger Vorton force. The Admiral made it clear that he did not think this was a good idea. He believed that humans were too primitive and too unpredictable to be useful in a military operation. Jake asked why the Coalition wanted humans involved if the Admiral thought they were not good enough. Admiral Kylex was quiet for a long moment. His yellow eyes seemed to be looking at something far away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. The Admiral admitted that the Vorton tactical methods had failed against the Scari. The pirates seemed to understand how Coalition forces thought and moved. They had studied Vorton tactics for years and learned how to beat them. The Coalition needed something different, something the Scari would not expect. Humans were different from other Coalition species in ways that the Admiral did not fully understand. Human soldiers did not always follow the plans their computers made. They changed their tactics in the middle of battle based on things that could not be calculated. Sometimes they did things that made no sense according to military theory, but somehow worked anyway. Jake thought about this as he looked at the hologram of the asteroid base. The Yahi Vorthan plan had been perfect in every way that could be measured, but perfect plans only worked when your enemy followed the rules. Maybe the Scari were not following the rules. Admiral Kylex told Jake that he would have 2 other humans with him on the mission. Sergeant Amy Chen was a demolitions expert who had a reputation for finding creative ways to blow things up. Corporal Danny Rodriguez was a technology specialist who somehow managed to make human equipment work with alien systems even when the manual said it was impossible. The Admiral finished the briefing by making his opinion very clear. He thought this mission would fail just like the last one. He believed that adding humans to the team would only make things worse. But his superiors had ordered him to try something new, and humans were the most unpredictable thing available. Jake stood up from the oversized chair and looked at the hologram one more time. The asteroid fortress looked just as dangerous as it had when he first saw it. But now he was starting to see it differently. The Scari had built their defenses to stop enemies who thought like Vorthons. Maybe that was their weakness. As Jake left the briefing room, he wondered if being unpredictable was really such a bad thing after all. 3 days later, Jake found himself standing in the equipment bay of a Coalition assault ship, watching his team prepare for the mission. Amy Chen was checking her explosive charges for the 3rd time that morning. She was a small woman with dark hair tied back in a tight knot, but Jake had seen her blow holes through starship hulls that were 3 feet thick. Her equipment cases were filled with devices that could turn solid rock into dust or cut through metal like it was paper. Danny Rodriguez sat cross-legged on the floor with his modified tablet connected to a tangle of cables and adapters. The device looked like it had been built from spare parts and alien technology that was never meant to work together. Danny had a talent for making incompatible systems talk to each other. His tablet could interface with Vorthon computers or Scari security systems equally well, even though the 2 technologies were completely different. Captain Zenth entered the equipment bay and looked around with obvious disapproval. The Vorthan Officer was smaller than Admiral Kylex, but still much taller than any of the humans. His scales were a lighter blue color, and the silver patterns on them were simpler, which meant he had a lower rank. He carried himself with the rigid posture that all Vorthan military officers learned in their training. Captain Zenth announced that the mission would begin in 1 hour. He reviewed the tactical plan one more time using a portable hologram projector. The plan was very similar to the one that had failed 3 days earlier. The main difference was that Jake's human team would be included as what Captain Zenth called an auxiliary support unit. The plan called for the coalition force to approach the asteroid in 2 waves. The first wave would consist of Vorthan fighters that would attack the outer defenses and draw the attention of the Skari defenders. The second wave would include the assault transports carrying the ground teams. Jake's unit would follow behind the main Vorthan assault team and provide backup support if needed. Amy raised her hand and asked a question that made Captain Zenth's expression grow even more disapproving. She wanted to know why they were using the same approach that had failed before. Captain Zenth explained that the tactical computers had analyzed the previous failure and made adjustments to account for the problems that had occurred. The new plan had a much higher probability of success. Danny looked up from his tablet and pointed out something that Jake had also noticed. The Skari defensive positions seemed deliberately inefficient. Their weapon placements created overlapping fields of fire that actually left gaps in their own coverage. It was like they were more interested in covering the most obvious approach routes than in creating the strongest possible defense. Captain Zenth dismissed their observations. He explained that the coalition tactical algorithms had already considered all possible defensive configurations. The Skari might appear to be using inefficient tactics, but that was probably because they lacked the advanced planning systems that the coalition used. Their defensive weaknesses would be exploited according to the established plan. Jake studied the holographic display and tried to think like a Skari pirate instead of like a coalition officer. The pirates had been raiding ships and stealing cargo for decades. They had survived by being clever and adaptable. They had learned to fight against coalition forces and win. Maybe their apparently inefficient defenses were actually a trap designed to catch enemies who thought they were smarter than pirates. The assault ship shuddered slightly as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Through the small windows in the equipment bay, Jake could see the asteroid field spread out before them. The Skari base was hidden among hundreds of other rocks that looked exactly the same. Only the energy signatures from their power generators gave away its location. Captain Zenth received a communication from the bridge and announced that the first wave of fighters was beginning their attack. On the tactical display, Jake could see small dots representing coalition ships moving toward the asteroid. Green lines showed their planned flight paths, and red dots marked the locations of Skari defensive weapons. The first wave attack proceeded, exactly as planned. Coalition fighters swept in from multiple directions and began firing on the outer defensive platforms. The Skari defenders responded with their own weapons and fighter craft. Explosions lit up the space around the asteroid as shields flared and weapons fired. Jake watched the battle unfold on the tactical display and noticed something that bothered him. The Skari response was almost perfectly timed to counter each. Coalition attack. When coalition fighters attacked from the left, the Skari moved defenders to block them. When the coalition shifted to attack from the right, the Skari were already moving to counter that threat, too. Amy was watching the same display, and she grabbed Jake's arm. She pointed out that the Skari were not just reacting to coalition moves. They were anticipating them. It was like they knew what the coalition was going to do before the coalition did it. Captain Zenth announced that the first wave had been successful and the second wave assault transports were moving in. Jake felt the deck vibrate under his feet as their ship accelerated toward the asteroid. Through the windows, he could see other transport ships moving in formation around them. The assault transports reached the asteroid's surface and began landing in the predetermined zones. Jake's team followed the Vorthan ground forces out of their ship and onto the rocky surface of the asteroid. The gravity was very light, which made movement feel strange. Each step carried them much further than it would have on a normal planet. The Vorthan assault team moved forward according to their tactical plan. They advanced in a precise formation, with scouts ahead and heavy weapons teams providing cover. Their movements were coordinated and efficient. Every soldier knew exactly where he was supposed to be and what he was supposed to do. Jake's human team followed behind the Vorthans as ordered. But as they moved deeper into the asteroid base, Jake began to see signs that something was wrong. The corridors they were moving through had been cleared of defenders too easily. The few Skari they encountered seemed to be retreating rather than fighting seriously. Danny's tablet was picking up electronic signals from deeper in the base. He reported that the Skari had much more sophisticated sensor equipment than the Coalition intelligence reports had indicated. They were tracking every movement the assault team made and probably coordinating their response from a central command center. Amy studied the construction of the tunnels as they moved through them. She pointed out that the rock around them had been carved in a way that would make certain areas easy to collapse. If someone wanted to trap invaders in these tunnels, it would be very easy to do. Captain Zenth ignored their warnings and continued to follow the tactical plan. He explained that the Coalition computers had already calculated the probability of traps and determined that the current route was the safest option available. The Vorthan assault team continued moving forward in their precise formation. Chip's trap was sprung 15 minutes later. The Skari had allowed the Coalition forces to penetrate deep into the base before sealing off their escape routes. Explosive charges brought down sections of tunnel behind the assault team, while defensive positions that had been hidden opened fire from concealed locations ahead. The Vorthan formation that had looked so professional moments before suddenly became a liability. The soldiers were bunched together in a way that made them easy targets. Their advanced planning had led them directly into a killing zone that the Skari had prepared specifically for them. Captain Zenth tried to reorganize his forces according to the emergency protocols, but the Skari had anticipated those responses too. Every move the Vorthans made seemed to make their situation worse. It was like playing a game where the other side knew all your moves before you made them. Jake made a decision that violated every principle of Coalition tactical doctrine. Instead of following Captain Zenth's orders to retreat to a secondary position, he led his team directly toward what appeared to be the most heavily defended section of the base. Amy and Danny followed him without question, even though his plan made no sense according to military theory. Captain Zenth's voice crackled through their communication devices, demanding to know why they were deviating from the mission parameters. Jake's response was a phrase that the Vorthan translation systems could not properly interpret. Sometimes you had to roll the dice and see what happened. Dr. Lisa Park was exactly where the intelligence reports had said she would be, but getting to her had required destroying half the infrastructure that surrounded her cell. She sat on a simple metal bench in a room carved from solid rock and looked up at Jake with eyes that showed both relief and confusion. The explosions had shaken dust and small rocks from the ceiling, and her dark hair was covered with gray powder. Jake helped Dr. Park to her feet and quickly examined her for injuries. She appeared to be unharmed, but she was clearly shaken by the violent rescue that had just taken place around her. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke, and Jake could tell that she had been crying recently. The Scari had not physically hurt her, but being captured and held prisoner by pirates had obviously been a terrifying experience. Amy was already setting up the equipment they would need to lift Dr. Park out through the hole she had blasted in, the ceiling. The improvised exit route was about 30 feet above them, and the walls of the crater were too steep to climb without assistance. Amy's rope and pulley system was designed for emergency extractions, but it had never been tested under conditions like these. Danny's tablet was showing multiple alerts as Scari security systems tried to respond to the damage that had been done to their base. The pirates were sending repair teams to restore power to the sections that had been knocked offline. They were also moving guards to secure the area around Dr. Park's former cell. The Scari were adapting to the situation, but they were still following predictable patterns based on their standard security protocols. Dr. Park asked what was happening, and Jake explained that they were coalition forces sent to rescue her. She wanted to know about the explosions and the structural damage, but Jake told her they would discuss details later when they were safely away from the Scari base. Right now, their priority was getting out before the pirates could organize an effective response. Amy tested her rope system by pulling on it with her full weight. The anchor points she had driven into the rock above seemed solid, but the entire structure of the asteroid had been weakened by the explosions. Jake could see new cracks appearing in the walls around them as the damaged sections continued to settle. They needed to complete the extraction quickly before the crater became unstable. Captain Zenth's voice came through their communicators with a status update on the main assault. The Vorthon forces had fought their way out of the trap that the Scari had prepared, but they had taken significant casualties in the process. The pirates were regrouping and preparing to launch a counterattack against the coalition landing zones. The extraction team needed to reach the pickup point within the next 20 minutes, or they would be stranded. Danny reported that he was detecting movement in the tunnels around their position. The Scari were sending teams to investigate the explosion and secure the area. The pirates probably assumed that the blast had been an accident caused by the fighting elsewhere in the base. They did not yet realize that coalition forces had reached Dr. Park's location through an unconventional route. Jake attached Dr. Park to Amy's rope system and explained how the extraction would work. She would be pulled up through the hole in the ceiling while he and his team provided cover from below. Once she reached the surface, Amy and Danny would follow. Jake would come last to make sure that no one was left behind. Dr. Park looked nervous about being lifted 30 feet through the air on a rope, but she understood that it was the only way out. Jake checked the harness that Amy had fitted around her chest and waist. The system was designed to support much more weight than one person, but it had not been tested under field conditions with improvised anchor points. Amy began operating the pulley system, and Dr. Park slowly rose toward the hole in the ceiling. The rope creaked under her weight but held steady. Jake kept his weapon ready and watched the entrances to the chamber for signs of approaching Scari guards. Danny monitored his tablet for electronic signatures that would indicate the location of enemy forces. Dr. Park was halfway to the surface when the first Scari patrol reached their location. 3 pirates appeared in the doorway of the chamber and immediately opened fire when they saw what was happening. Jake and Danny took cover behind the metal furniture in the cell and returned fire while Amy continued operating the pulley system. The Scari weapons were energy-based and left glowing, scorch marks on the rock walls where their shots hit. Jake's projectile weapon was less advanced, but more reliable in the dusty environment created by the explosions. The solid bullets punched through the light armor that the pirates wore and forced them to take cover in the corridor outside the chamber. Dr. Park reached the surface, and Amy quickly disconnected her from the rope system. The scientist immediately moved away from the edge of the crater as Amy had instructed her to do. Danny was next to go up, and he clipped his tablet too, his belt as Amy attached him to the rope harness. More Scari arrived and began firing from multiple positions around the chamber. Jake could see at least 6 pirates in the corridors leading into the room, and more were probably on their way. The enemy was not using sophisticated tactics, but they had superior numbers, and they knew the layout of their own base better than the rescue team did. Danny reached the surface, and Amy began lowering the rope for Jake. But before he could attach himself to the harness, a Scari grenade bounced into the chamber and exploded against the far wall. The blast knocked Jake to the ground and sent rock fragments flying through the air. His ears were ringing, and he could taste blood in his mouth. Jake struggled to his feet and grabbed the rope harness, but more grenades were being thrown into the chamber. The Scari had decided that destroying the area was acceptable if it meant stopping the Coalition rescue team. The pirates were willing to damage their own base to prevent Dr. Park from being extracted. Amy's voice came through, Jake's communicator telling him to hurry because the anchor points for the rope system were starting to pull loose from the damaged rock above. The repeated explosions were weakening the crater walls, and the entire structure was becoming unstable. If the rope system failed, Jake would be trapped with no way to reach the surface. Jake attached himself to the harness just as another grenade exploded near the entrance to the chamber. The blast wave knocked him against the wall, but the rope held, and Amy began pulling him upward. Scari weapons fire followed him as he rose through the crater, but the angle made it difficult for the pirates to target him effectively. Jake reached the surface and found Dr. Park, Amy, and Danny waiting for him behind a pile of rocks that provided cover from Scari positions elsewhere in the base. Danny's tablet was showing the locations of Coalition pickup ships that were approaching their position. The nearest landing zone was about 200 meters away across terrain that was covered by enemy defensive positions. Dr. Park was breathing heavily, and her hands were shaking from the stress of the extraction, but she was alert and ready to move. She asked Jake if all Coalition rescues were this violent, and he told her that this one had been more difficult than usual. He did not mention that the violence had been necessary because conventional extraction methods would have failed against the Scari defensive systems. Amy was already planning their route to the pickup point using cover from the rocky terrain and the damaged sections of the base. The explosions had created new craters and debris piles that could hide their movement, but the same damage had also alerted the Scari to their presence. The pirates would be watching for Coalition forces trying to reach the landing zones. Danny reported that Coalition air support was available, but the pilots needed target information before they could attack Scari positions. The human team could guide the strikes using Danny's tablet, but they would need to get closer to the enemy positions to get accurate targeting data. That meant moving through areas where they would be exposed to enemy fire. Jake made the decision to split his team for the final phase of the extraction. Amy would escort Dr. Park directly to the pickup point using the safest route available. Jake and Danny would move through the more dangerous areas to spot targets for the airstrikes. The plan increased the risk to Jake and Danny, but it gave Dr. Park the best chance of reaching safety. Captain Zenth's voice came through their communicators with an urgent message. Scari reinforcements were approaching the Coalition landing zones from multiple directions. The extraction teams had less than 10 minutes to reach their pickup ships before the pirates could overwhelm the Coalition ground forces. After that point, the ships would have to leave without them to avoid being destroyed. Amy moved quickly across the broken terrain, leading Dr. Park toward the Coalition pickup zone, while Jake and Danny took a more dangerous route that would allow them to spot targets for airstrikes. The surface of the asteroid was covered with debris from the fighting and new craters created by explosions during the battle. Rocks that had been blasted loose by weapons fire provided cover, but also created obstacles that slowed their movement. Dr. Park was keeping up well despite not being trained for this kind of physical activity. The scientist had worked on alien worlds before, and she understood the importance of following instructions exactly when her life depended on it. Amy guided her through the safest path available while constantly watching for scary positions that might threaten them. Jake and Danny approached a scary defensive position that was blocking one of the main routes to the landing zone. The pirates had set up heavy weapons behind rock barriers and were firing at any coalition forces that tried to move through the area. Danny's tablet could provide exact coordinates for an airstrike, but they needed to get close enough to confirm. The target location. The scary defensive position was well constructed according to standard military principles. The heavy weapons had overlapping fields of fire, and the rock barriers provided excellent protection from most forms of attack. But the position had been designed to stop enemies who would approach from predictable directions using conventional tactics. Jake and Danny reached a point where they could see the scary position clearly, but they were also exposed to enemy fire if they were discovered. Danny connected his tablet to a sensor array that he had improvised from spare parts and coalition equipment. The device could determine exact coordinates for targets, but it needed several minutes to complete an accurate scan. Coalition fighters appeared in the sky above the asteroid and began attacking scary positions based on the targeting information that Danny was providing. The airstrikes were precise and effective because the pilots could see exactly where to aim their weapons. Explosions erupted across the surface as defensive positions that had been threatening coalition ground forces were destroyed. Amy and Dr. Park reached the pickup zone just as the coalition transport ship was landing. The pilot was maintaining radio contact with Captain Zenth and reporting that scary reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions. The coalition ground forces needed to complete their extractions quickly or risk being overrun by superior numbers. Dr. Park was loaded onto the transport ship along with other personnel who had been rescued from various locations around the asteroid. The scientist looked back at the damaged Scary base and asked Amy how many coalition soldiers had been injured during the rescue operation. Amy told her that casualties had been much lighter than expected because the human team had found ways to neutralize enemy defenses without direct confrontation. Jake and Danny completed their targeting mission and began moving toward their own pickup point. The airstrikes had cleared most of the scary defensive positions between them and the landing zone, but pirates were still moving through the area trying to reach coalition forces before they could escape. The timing would be close, but it looked like they would make it to their extraction point. Captain Zent's voice came through their communicators with a message that surprised Jake. The Vorthan officer was requesting permission to study the methods that the human team had used during the rescue operation. Captain Zenth admitted that the results had been far better than he had expected, and he wanted to understand how techniques that violated established protocols could be so effective. The coalition transport ships lifted off from the asteroid's surface carrying all personnel who had been extracted from the Scary base. Dr. Park was safe, and the mission had been completed successfully despite the failure of conventional tactics during the initial assault. As they flew away from the asteroid, Jake could see the damage that had been done to the pirate base during the fighting. Admiral Kylex was waiting for them when they returned to the Coalition flagship. The tall Vorthan officer listened to Captain Zenth's report about the mission with an expression that Jake could not read. The Admiral asked detailed questions about the methods that the human team had used and why those methods had been more successful than standard coalition tactics. Jake explained that the Skari had prepared their defenses to counter enemies who would follow predictable patterns based on military doctrine. The pirates had studied coalition tactics for years and learned exactly how Vorthon forces would respond to different situations. But they had not prepared for enemies who would ignore doctrine and improvise solutions based on immediate circumstances. Amy described how she had used explosive charges in ways that were not recommended by safety manuals but were effective against enemy positions that had been designed to resist conventional attacks. Her techniques worked because they created chaos and confusion rather than following predetermined patterns that could be anticipated and countered. Danny explained how he had accessed Skari computer systems through interfaces that were never meant to be used by outsiders. His approach worked because he treated each system as a unique puzzle rather than following standard protocols that the enemy had learned to defend against. The Skari security programs could not stop attacks that did not follow expected patterns. Admiral Kylex was quiet for a long time after hearing their explanations. He studied the tactical recordings of the mission and compared them to the failed assault that had preceded it. The Vorthon forces had been more numerous and better equipped, but they had been defeated because their enemies knew exactly what they were going to do. The human team had succeeded because they had done things that made no sense according to military theory. Dr. Park was debriefed by Coalition intelligence officers who wanted to learn everything she had observed during her captivity. The information she provided about Skari capabilities and methods would be valuable for planning future operations against the pirates. But more importantly, her successful rescue had demonstrated that Coalition forces could adapt their tactics to deal with enemies who had learned to counter their standard methods. 3 months later, Admiral Kylex issued a directive that would change how the Coalition conducted high-risk extraction missions. Every operation of this type would include at least one human operative in a tactical advisory role. The directive noted that human problem-solving methods were often unconventional, but frequently effective in situations where standard approaches had failed. The official report that was distributed throughout the Coalition military described human tactical methodology in diplomatic language that avoided suggesting that established doctrine was inadequate. But officers who read the report understood that something significant had changed in how the Coalition approached difficult military problems. Captain Zenth requested assignment to work with human units on future missions. He wanted to learn more about tactical flexibility and adaptive problem-solving. Other Vorthon officers began studying human military history to understand how such a technologically primitive species had developed such effective combat methods. Training programs were established to teach Coalition officers about human approaches to tactical problems. The courses were voluntary, but they quickly became popular among officers who had experienced failures using conventional methods. The instructors emphasized that human techniques could not be easily programmed into computer systems because they depended on intuition and creativity rather than calculation. Jake received a promotion and was assigned to develop new training protocols for mixed-species tactical teams. His job was to help Coalition forces learn when to follow established doctrine and when to abandon it in favor of improvised solutions. The work was challenging because it required teaching systematic thinkers to embrace controlled chaos. Amy became the Coalition's leading expert on unconventional demolitions and explosive techniques. Her methods were studied and cataloged, but instructors warned that her approaches should only be attempted by personnel with extensive experience and excellent judgment. The line between creative destruction and dangerous recklessness was often very thin. Danny was assigned to work with Coalition technology specialists to develop new approaches to electronic warfare and system infiltration. His techniques were difficult to teach because they required an intuitive understanding of how different technologies could be made to work together in ways their designers had never intended. The unofficial motto that emerged among Coalition extraction teams became a phrase that was difficult to translate into most alien languages. The human concept of controlled improvisation did not exist in Vorthan military thinking or in the tactical doctrines of most other species, but the results spoke for themselves. When everything else failed, adding humans to the mission usually produced unexpected solutions that worked despite violating every principle of sound military planning. It was not a strategy that could be systematically applied, but it was an approach that had proven effective when conventional methods were insufficient. The galaxy was a dangerous place filled with enemies who were clever. Amy pulled her equipment pack off her back and began removing explosive charges that were definitely not meant to be used inside an occupied structure. Jake could see her calculating blast patterns in her head as she looked at the walls around them. The tunnel they were in had been carved from solid rock, but Amy was studying it like she could see exactly where the weak points were located. Danny crouched against the wall with his tablet displaying a three-dimensional map of the area around them. His modified sensors were picking up power conduits and structural supports that ran through the rock. He was also detecting the electronic signatures of defensive weapons and security systems that were designed to stop intruders like them. The sounds of battle echoed through the tunnels behind them as Captain Zenth's forces tried to fight their way out of the trap the Skari had prepared. The Vorthon soldiers were following their emergency protocols exactly as they had been trained, but the pirates seemed to know what those protocols were. Every tactical manual that the Coalition used appeared to be familiar to their enemies. Amy announced that she was ready to blow a hole through the wall that would take them into a section of the base that was not supposed to be accessible from their current location. Her explosive charges were shaped to direct the blast away from their position, but the explosion would still be loud enough to alert every Skari in the area to their presence. Jake approved the plan, even though it went against every rule in the Coalition safety manual. Amy's charges were not designed to be used in enclosed spaces, and the blast could easily cause a structural collapse that would trap them underground. But following the rules had not worked for Captain Zenth's forces, and Jake was not interested. In walking into the same trap, the explosion shook the entire section of the asteroid and sent vibrations through the rock that could be felt hundreds of meters away. Amy's charges did not just create a hole in the wall. They started a cascade of smaller explosions as power conduits overloaded and structural supports failed. The carefully planned defensive positions that the Skari had prepared began to shift and change as their foundations cracked. Danny led them through the hole that Amy had created and into a service corridor that ran parallel to the main tunnels. His tablet showed that this area was not covered by the same sensor networks that had been tracking the Vorthon forces. The Skari defensive plan had not accounted for someone breaking through solid rock to create their own entrance. The service corridor was narrow and filled with pipes and cables that carried power and water throughout the base. Danny connected his tablet to some of the cables and began accessing the base's internal systems. The Skari security programs tried to block him, but Danny treated each system like a puzzle that had multiple solutions instead of following standard interface protocols. Amy continued setting explosive charges as they moved through the service areas, but she was not using them to blast through walls anymore. Instead, she was placing them at key structural points where small explosions would cause maximum disruption to the base's systems. Her charges were turning the Scari's own infrastructure against them. Jake could hear the confusion in the radio. Communications that Danny was intercepting from the Scari defenders. The pirates had prepared for an assault by coalition forces that would follow predictable patterns. They had not prepared for enemies who would deliberately damage the structural integrity of their own location or who would access their systems through interfaces that were never meant to be used by outsiders. The Scari Command Center was trying to coordinate a response to threats that their tactical planning had not considered. Their defensive positions were designed to channel coalition forces into predetermined killing zones, but those zones were becoming unstable as Amy's explosives damaged the supports that held them together. Their sensor networks were being compromised by Danny's electronic intrusions through systems that were supposed to be isolated from external access. Captain Zenth's voice came through their communication devices with reports that the Vorthan forces were beginning to make progress. The Scari defensive positions that had been so effective minutes earlier were becoming confused and disorganized. The pirates were having to redeploy their forces to deal with threats that were coming from directions they had not expected. Jake led his team deeper into the service areas of the base, following a route that did not exist on any tactical map. They were moving through maintenance shafts and utility corridors that the Scari themselves probably rarely used. Danny's tablet showed that they were getting closer to the section where Dr. Park was being held, but they were approaching from an angle that the base's defenses had not been designed to protect. Amy found a power distribution center that controlled the lighting and environmental systems for half of the base. Her explosives could not destroy the center completely without risking the life of their rescue target, but she could overload it in a way that would cause rolling blackouts throughout the facility. The Scari would lose their coordination advantage if they could not see what was happening in their own base. The lights went out in sections throughout the asteroid as Amy's charges triggered cascading failures in the power grid. Emergency lighting came on automatically, but it was much dimmer and created deep shadows that changed the entire tactical situation. The Scari defensive positions that had been carefully planned for full lighting conditions became much less effective in the semi-darkness. Danny's intrusion into the base computer systems was giving him access to information that the Scari did not know they were sharing. He could see the locations of defensive teams and weapon positions. More importantly, he could see the automated systems that controlled access to the section where Dr. Park was being held. The security protocols were sophisticated, but they had not been designed to resist someone who approached them as puzzles rather than as barriers. The human team reached a ventilation shaft that ran directly over the area where their target was located. According to Danny's scans, Dr. Park was being held in a cell that was surrounded by automated defensive systems designed to kill anyone who tried to reach her through conventional routes. The Scari had learned from previous coalition rescue attempts and created a trap that would be triggered by any standard extraction procedure. Jake studied the sensor readings that showed the defensive layout around Dr. Park's location. The automated weapons were positioned to cover every approach that coalition tactical doctrine would recommend. The sensors were calibrated to detect standard coalition equipment and movement patterns. The entire system was designed to counter enemies who followed the rules that military academies taught. Amy looked at the ventilation shaft and then at her remaining explosive charges. She was calculating blast patterns again, but this time she was thinking about how to collapse part of the base in a way that would create a new exit route rather than destroy an existing barrier. Her plan would require precise timing and careful placement of charges in locations that no safety manual would ever approve. Danny was mapping the power systems that controlled the automated defenses around Dr. Park's cell. The weapons were powered by redundant sources that would keep them active even if the main power grid failed. But the control systems that told them what to target were more vulnerable. If he could overload those systems at exactly the right moment, the weapons might become confused about what they were supposed to protect. Captain Zenth's voice came through their communicators with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. His forces were making progress through areas of the base that had been impassable minutes earlier. The Scari defensive plan was falling apart as their carefully prepared positions became unstable and their coordination networks failed. Jake made the decision to proceed with Amy's plan even though it violated every safety protocol that existed. For rescue operations, they were going to collapse the section of the asteroid that contained Dr. Park's cell and extract her through a hole that would be created by controlled demolition. The plan would work, or it would kill everyone involved, including the person they were trying to save. Amy began placing her final charges at structural points that would direct the collapse away from Dr. Park's location while simultaneously destroying the automated defenses around her cell. Danny prepared to overload the control systems at the exact moment when the explosives detonated. Jake checked his equipment and prepared to rappel down through whatever opening Amy's charges created. The explosion was carefully controlled but still powerful enough to shake the entire asteroid. A section of the base that had been solid rock moments before became a crater with steep sides and a clear view of the space above. The automated weapons that had been protecting Dr. Park's cell were buried under tons of debris, and their control systems were fried by Danny's electronic attack. Jake dropped through the hole that Amy had created and found Dr. Park stunned but unharmed in her cell. The woman was a scientist, not a soldier, and she looked terrified by the explosions and structural collapse around her. But she was alive, and that was what mattered for the mission. As they prepared to extract Dr. Park through their improvised exit route,